Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another one of the training workshop in the series to support water suppliers in their urban water management plans planning. Today's topic is incorporation of climate change considerations into the plan. Looks like people are still joining, but I'm just going to get started with some of the logistical things that we do to just make sure everybody has all the technical support that they need to be able to participate today. If you have any questions, actually, Sophie, who's usually joining us, is not going to be here. Instead, my colleague, Danica DeBow, is going to provide any technical support. So should you have any questions, feel free to use the chat panel to request or ask questions. If you want to ask questions of our presenters today, please use the Q&A panel, or alternatively, please use the hand raise in the participant panel if you want to ask a question in person and join the discussion. Just a quick reminder on the Q&A panel, you can ask a question at the bottom. If you see a question that is particularly important, you can vote it up to let us know that this is important. Or if you have any comments or clarification or want to build on a question that has been posed by another participant, you can use the comment as well. Please remember that we're really going to be focusing on the Q&A panel for the discussion with the presenters today. We'd ask you to let us know how familiar you are with preparing the plan to help our presenters as they're getting ready to provide information today. You can see from the chart that we have quite a bit of participants who have already had some experience with the plan. And so we're really focusing on the updates and changes to the plan. Some of you are doing it for the first time, mostly with some support, but there's some of you who this is their first time. And we hope that these training modules that we're creating and recording are helpful to all of you. For our workshop today, our purpose today is to present information, some ideas, recommendations, and how you might consider incorporating climate change into the plan in terms of water demand, supply, and reliability. We're going to start the workshop with Julie Ekströms, who's going to really just orient us around the plan and where climate change might fit in. And then we have three different presenters today who are going to provide information that really represent a range of resources and capacities that suppliers may have in terms of data and information to support their climate change considerations. So we'll give you an opportunity to see what it looks like at different levels. We're going to take a quick short break in the middle of the workshop to just take our eyes away from the screen for a little bit, and we'll plan on wrapping up at noon. One thing that we added here, given that this is a new requirement, is to the extent that we have time, we would love to hear from you how you're thinking about incorporating climate change resources. So we'll come back to that at the end of the workshop. We want to find out what is your level of experience working with climate change data and the level of emphasis that your management, your leadership may place in climate change inclusion, just in general. This will help our presenters. So please help us by answering the introductory poll. You should be able to see that. You can use the gray bar on the right side to just scroll down to the second question. There are two questions here that we're asking. So I'll wait a few seconds to give everybody an opportunity to respond to the poll. As you're responding, it looks like there's quite a range. All right, so hopefully everybody who wanted to has been able to respond to the poll. I'm going to end it. and just share it. And you can see that we have a real range of experience joining us today. And for the second question, many of you expressing the fact that this is becoming an emphasis and that you're already been thinking about climate change inclusion in your work, which is terrific. So we're looking forward to hearing from everyone today. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Ekstrom, who's a Senior Environmental Scientist Supervisor with DWR's Water Use Efficiency Branch. Go ahead, Julia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ari. Could you just give me a thumbs up? You can hear me real quick?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. So thank you all for joining us today, and welcome back for those of you that participated in yesterday's webinar. So I'm just going to go quickly over where does climate change fit in terms of preparing your urban water management plan. And then we're going to get to our three fantastic speakers, and I'm very excited that we have them today. So let's see, we're going to go to the next slide, Ari. So these are essentially the core substance of the urban water management plan. I tinkered with this a little bit since yesterday, but so in the middle here, we have characterizing supplies and your demand, and then assessing your reliability. And then the main, the big plans or the assessments that come out of that. And then on the left-hand side, we have compliance with SBX 77. So we've had webinars, including yesterday, about that. And so that's about complying with your water use targets. Next. So there are other important pieces related to the core. And for each of these, we've offered training sessions. And we have, I put here climate change at the bottom and how that overlaps with assessing your supply and your demand and reliability. And also can be incorporated into a drought risk assessment looking forward. But if you go to the next slide, we have where all these purple arrows are all the webinars, the training sessions for those preparing urban water management plans. The lighter purple are the ones that we've already held, and they're recorded and posted on YouTube. And the darker purple ones are upcoming. So today's is on climate change. But if you're interested in other topics that you need to cover in your urban water management plan, a lot of these webinars go in detail about these topics. And so people have been saying that this has been helpful so far. So we will have 3 upcoming after this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Now, in terms of like the building blocks of the urban water management plan, just wanted to relate climate change to this. So the Urban Water Management Planning Act requires a demonstration of the ability for a supplier to meet customer demands under various supply conditions. And so this focus on reliability is important, and this is useful over several planning horizons. Next slide. So you characterize the supply, you characterize your demand, and then from that, you're able to assess your reliability. And next slide. So this involves assessments on an annual basis, near term, and also long term. So for each of these kind of bubbles right here, the supply, demand, characterization, and reliability. And the long-term requirement is where climate change considerations clearly are relevant. Supply and demand characterizations also have to include this long-term assessment. So they have to do by normal water year, a single dry year, and then also of a drought of 5 consecutive dry years. So this is all over increments of 5 years, looking out 20 to 25 years. And so that's the big connection. And I just wanted to show you briefly, in the next slide, some of the legal language. And I'm not going to go exhaustive through this, but I just wanted to point out that really in the water code relevant to the Urban Water Management Planning Act, there are code sections that are, and these are all listed out in Appendix I, by the way, that has been drafted and is not changing much for the final guidebook. So we will post the link to that in case you haven't looked at that, but I think it's a step farther along than what was provided in 2015 for climate change guidance. And so hopefully you find that helpful. But so we have all the laws that are listed out in the very beginning of Appendix I. So, first, climate change, the premise of the Urban Water Management Plan Act, it mentions climate change twice and right up front. So climate change is one of a bundle of factors to consider for why we need to manage water resources efficiently. Our growing population, climate change, the economy, the environment, and then next slide, there's another declaration from the legislature in the Water Code that highlights that climate change is important to include in planning for long-term water resources reliability. Okay, so that's this is the premise. And then in next slide, in Water Code section 10.631, it gets into the substance of what is required. And that's the need to consider climate change in the assessment of each supply. Okay, so that's what is, I believe, chapter 4 in the guidebook is that you need to assess or characterize your supplies, each supply. And then in the next slide, it points to Water Code section 10.635, and that's the drought risk assessment. That again states the requirement to incorporate climate change considerations into both the characterization of projected supply and projected water demand. And so that's an over the 20 or up to 25 years outlook. And the reliability assessment is also as part of the drought risk assessment. So in terms of where the requirements are, this is essentially the core. And that is the extent to which it is described in law of what the requirements are. So that leaves it flexible for how you pursue this and deem it useful for your own assessment, which is great, but it also probably begs the question, okay, what's next? What do we do? What should we do? And so that's why we are excited to have our next 3 speakers go into what can you do and where is information available, because California has invested a lot into understanding and developing projections and understanding how climate change is going to affect our state and also in different regions. And so there's a lot of the path paved already, but it really depends on the supplier and their needs and what their supplies look like, what their demand looks like. And then the next slide that I just wanted to show quickly and kind of flagging it, that there are particular tables that they're not climate change tables, but they are areas where you could incorporate it. So in chapter of the guidebook, chapter 4, we have the water use characterization. And first, I guess I didn't mention that you could incorporate it into your system description in the narrative. That would be an appropriate place, how climate change could affect it just generally. And then the water use characterization, looking at tables 4-2 and 4-3. And then in the next slide, we have the water supply characterization, tables 6.4 and 6.9, possibly, that go out, in the 5-year increments over 20 to 25 years. And next slide. And then the water reliability evaluations, tables 7.2, 7.3, 7.4. So if you want to include it in these in the tables, this is where you would incorporate. And of course you would describe, what you did and how you incorporate it in your narrative portions of your plan. And so I think that that's all I wanted to go through before we get to our main panelists.
Thanks, Julie. So let's see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. I'm just going to give it a few seconds to see if anybody wants to type in, or if you want to hand raise, use the hand raise function. Okay. All right. Well, in this case, since there are no questions, we're going to move forward. And I just want to introduce Jennifer Morales, who's a senior environmental scientist working in the DWR climate change program since 2011 and has been with the department for 11 years. She's DWR's Central Valley Regional Climate Change Specialist and the acting specialist for Southern California. Jennifer graduated with a degree in organismal, evolutionary, and ecological biology and lives in Fresno with her husband and 3 kids. So thanks, Jennifer. We're looking forward to your presentation. Looks like you're all ready to go.
Thanks, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for being here with us today. So I am going to be representing today a water supplier that would be on the smaller side, might have limited resources, really maybe hasn't done a whole lot of climate change investigation yet, hasn't done a lot of analysis, or maybe I'm part of the kind of the 32% in the poll who said, I really have no experience with this. I'm just kind of starting out and I want to see what's out there. So that's the approach I'm going to take today. And then you'll see as we go on through our next speakers that we the bar keeps moving up from me because we really want to make sure that we're accommodating everybody who's here today and accommodating everybody's capacity for doing climate change analysis. So what I've done as a smaller supplier, I have went and read the handbook, or read the guidebook, the Urban Water Management Planning Guidebook, and I kind of gleaned from it that these are some steps that I need to start with. It says I need to do a vulnerability assessment, which they provided in the guidebook. I believe it's section 1.6. And so I did that for my water supplies that I've identified. And now I need to start gathering some projections, some climate change impact projections for my water supplies. And then after that, I need to go ahead and look at what are some potential adaptation and mitigation strategies that I can take. So for this exercise, like I said, I have taken on the fictional persona of Jenville, California. I am a small agricultural community located on the inland central coast. We have a moderate amount of ecotourism. We have some wineries. We have some really high value crops that we produce, strawberries, avocados. We have a pretty well varied portfolio of water. We definitely rely heavily on groundwater. We do have riparian rights on a small local stream, and we do get a small allotment from the State Water Project. Now, just remember, everybody, this is completely fictional, okay? Because I didn't want to call out any particular area, so this is not a real place. Just want to make that abundantly clear. Okay. So I know, because I've been, working for my local water supply agency for a little while, and I've lived in the area for a while. I've lived in Jenville for a while, and just kind of hearing through the grapevine, I know of some resources, right? So I know that people talk about this website called CalAdapt that's really easy to use. They say you can kind of go there and get climate change projections. I've never used it before, but I do know that it exists. I've heard about it. I also know that we have a really active IRWM group in my area. It's the Santa Barbara County Integrated Regional Water Management Group. I have never gone to any of their meetings, but again, I've heard about them. I know they're really active, so I'm going to go. That's something I think I probably am going to look into. We are part of a groundwater sustainability agency, obviously since SGMA came out, but we've been rated as a very low priority groundwater basin. So we don't have a groundwater sustainability plan yet. We are right next to an adjudicated basin, so I know I can kind of go there and get some information, but that's kind of where I'm at with the groundwater stuff. I also know that my local county has a hazard mitigation plan that I'm pretty sure there's some climate change information in there. And we also have a general plan, which I also know that there's some climate change information in there. I've never looked at those sections before, but I know that these are just some of kind of the resources that I pulled from my head as I'm starting to think about climate change in my area. So first place I went to is CalAdapt. You know, like, what is this CalAdapt thing? I went right to the website, and these 12 kind of tools popped up. These 12 links popped up, and I was like, "Wow, this is a lot of stuff." So what do I want to look? Let's see. I'm assuming I can look at all these. I can look at my area from all these different angles. It says local climate change snapshot. That sounds kind of interesting. Annual averages. Maps of projected change. Wow, there's a lot of stuff here. But you know what? What really caught my eye was the extended drought scenarios. So I think that's where I'm going to start exploring climate change impacts for Genville. And so I went in there and I selected where my community is. It said change location. I put it right in the center of my little community, and it provided some future climate change impacts for my area. And I had a lot of options kind of for what I wanted to see in these projections. And I told it I want to see, obviously, like I said, this is an extended drought scenario, because I'm really concerned about drought in my area. We suffered through that unprecedented 5-year drought that really affected us. Our riparian stream kind of dried up. Our agriculture, we were really starting to get kind of worried about our agriculture, and our groundwater tables kind of dropped. And so I know like drought is really like something I'm concerned about. So that's why I picked this, and I had the option to pick early 21st century drought or a late century drought. And I picked early because I noticed that happened to coincide really well with the timing requirements for the urban water management planning. I know it said I need to go out to about 2040, 2045, somewhere around there. So I said, oh, that really coincides well. So I went ahead and took a look at what they're saying my future might look like during an extended drought period. And I could see that I can really expect that there might be some serious impacts from a drought into the future. And I could see that I can expect temperatures might increase by several degrees into the future. I see that my minimum temperatures, my overnight temperatures are also going to increase, which is kind of a concern for me because we grow stones, we grow avocados in our area, we grow things that kind of require some overnight chilling. I also know that that's going to require more water, me watering more if the temperatures overnight are not dropping as much. And I also noticed that we could really expect a decline in precipitation over an extended drought period. So this is helping me to kind of plan for a range of possible increases in those temperatures and decreases in precipitation. I only chose those 3 to look at, but if you look at the options on the left-hand side, I also could have looked at evapotranspiration, which is really important to me as an agricultural community. I could have looked at changes in base flow and runoff, which are also very, very important to me. But I'm just kind of starting this exploration, so this stuff is really interesting to know the ranges of my possible future under climate change. So then my next step, and I apologize, we can't look at everything. I can't look at all the resources in the time that we have allotted today, but this is just kind of to, get everybody started a little bit. And so the next thing I want to look at is that, I'm sorry, let me just say one more thing about CalAdapt. So that was only one of the 12 tools available to me on CalAdapt. So when I have some more time, I'm going to go back and explore the rest of these tools and see see what else I come up with. I really appreciate the fact that all of the data resources are listed there with the tools, so I know exactly where that data came from. I could cite it easily. I could choose which data I want to use. So if I know in particular one of the, maybe I found out that my county has done a climate change adaptation plan, and they have identified that particular data sets work better for my area than others, I can choose those data sets while using CalAdapt, just because I know they work better for my area. So I'm going to go and explore some of these other 11 tools later on, and also see what kind of is going to help me prepare my urban water management plan. So the next thing I go to look at is my UWM plan. And thankfully, it was just updated in 2019. Like I said, I'm very lucky to live in an area that has a very robust UWM. And they have a really big chapter on climate change that's so helpful. And I'm going to kind of just read through this and glean what I can about the impacts to my area from climate change. And as I'm going through here, I find these really, really helpful charts. So like I said, I was really concerned about the impacts that are from climate change that are going to come to my area, and I want to know what the ranges are that I can expect. Well, within my RWM plan, there's a chart right here that kind of lists out all of the ranges that we can expect in the region, from temperature, precipitation, sea level rise. Well, I'm inland, but we do have groundwater, so I am a little concerned about sea level rise, saltwater intrusion. And as well, it's showing me what I can expect from my long-term delivery averages for my state water project allotment. I'm in the Santa Barbara region, like I said, and so we have an allocation, and so it's kind of telling me there I can expect up to about a third less water into the future under climate change. So that's something I really need to prepare for with the supplies that I've identified in my plan. Some other charts that I found really convenient. Like I said, I did fill out the vulnerability assessment for Genville that was provided in the urban water management plan. But then I also find that my RWM has done a very robust vulnerability assessment for the region, where they have not only identified the impacts, but they prioritize them. And they prioritize them both based on not just the impacts, but what our vulnerabilities are. And so they've really identified that groundwater, is going to be impacted by saltwater intrusion, rising sea levels from climate change, and that we need to be concerned about constituents in the water, and then it kind of goes down from there. So this is really helpful for me. Lastly, which was very helpful, is that I realized that my IWM has provided a list of mitigation and adaptation strategies for the area. So now that I've identified what the vulnerabilities are, now what are we going to do about it? And so, they have a whole list here of mitigation adaptation strategies that are customized to my region. And not only that, but within my RWM plan, they also have projects that they've identified that will help us achieve our mitigation and adaptation strategies. So I know that this is just a beginning for me exploring climate change in my area. And I know now that I probably want to get a little bit more involved in my IWM. I'm going to go continue exploring those features on CalAdapt. I'm going to go look at some of those other resources, the hazard mitigation plan, my general plan for my area, and then I really am going to kind of have an internal discussion with the decision makers at my agency to see what the next steps are. I'm going to show them what I have come up with, and we really need to do an internal assessment about our next steps, and maybe assess what kind of internal capacity we have. Do we have staff on hand who might be able to explore these impacts a little further, and could we generate the climate change section of our urban water management plan in-house, or do we have possibly the resources that we could hire outside of our agency to have that done? Or are there some grants that we can apply for that can help us do a climate change assessment? So we really need to kind of look inward and find out what our next steps are going to be. Because this, for me, it was just the beginning. This is just the tip of the iceberg of looking at what my climate change impacts could be into the future. So with that, I think that we'll go into Q&A.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm waiting to see if there are any questions in the Q&A panel, or if anyone wants to raise their hand. I see one hand raised, so we'll take that while we're waiting for other people to type in their questions. So this is Rajat Chakraborty who has a question, and you should be able to unmute and speak now.
Hi, Jennifer. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
So I like your presentation about climate change, and I'm representing Jacobs, and my name is Rajat Chakraborty. I'm calling from Simi Valley, actually, Ventura County, not far from you. The question is about you showed about the precipitation average and the temperature average, but here when we analyzed something using some model, we looked at it. Actually, most important part is IDF, intensity, duration, frequency. So the intensity would be higher, what many modelers they said about it. So are you this thing is concerned about the intensity of flow? Although average year-wise may be low, but intensity would be higher, what most of the models they say about climate change models, I mean. So do you see this has some impact on the analysis?
Yeah, well, so I think I understand what Rajat is asking is that what the models, and I'm sorry, this is very simplified, my summary here, but are you saying that, is it a concern that what the models are showing versus what kind of might be the reality, is that the reality might be much more severe than what the models are showing? Is that kind of what I'm...
Yes, that is correct.
Yes.
When you look at the return period, some flood actually you may see, like I'm giving some example numbers, like in 2 years,
Sure.
compared to in other times, maybe those things you would see like 5 years interval. So instead of 5-year interval, you see 2 years. So the return period reduced with a new climate change impact. So do you see some way that thing is important?
Yes, I think it's definitely very important, and it's really important that we know and can try to prepare to the best of our abilities for the absolute worst case. The thing though is that with this presentation where we were at here, this is really for a person or for an agency who was just starting out, who was just kind of exploring what the basic climate change impacts might be. But yeah, Rajat brings up a very valid point that, and it's not just with precipitation, it's with temperature, it's with extreme events, it's with so many things that we have been seeing is that the models are under predicting the extremeness of climate change in some cases. And so yeah, what you're saying is very valid. It might not be something a person at my level of planning for this exercise, that is, can be concerned about yet, but it's definitely something that is an issue, it's valid, and probably would come up in one of our other two speakers where they go to a higher level, a deeper degree of planning, where I think that they might touch on that a little bit more.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both. There is just one other comment and question from Kelsey Oshira, who says, CalAdapt is really useful. Thanks. Is there a default best recommended GCM to use?
You know what? I am going to let Wyatt answer that question because he is probably more familiar with those than I would be.
Okay.
Yes, there are actually four. There are four GCMs that were identified through the California climate change statewide assessment, the fourth assessment that was done, I think it completed and published in 2018. There are four that represent essentially the four most common projected conditions. So that would be wet and moderate warming, dry and very, very warm, cooler and dry, and what they call the complement, which is the one that's different from the others. Now, that's not one model. So it's very hard to get to a single model that would represent, you know, the range of potential futures. Now, the other way to come at this is, and I'll get at this in my talk, is that you basically take an ensemble average of all the models, and you construct a scenario out of that, and you can use that as your sort of central tendency, your most likely condition out of all of those projected futures.
All right. Well, thank you, Wyatt. This is actually a nice segue into your presentation. You gave us a little preview of what's to come. So we're going to move forward. Thanks, Jennifer, for your presentation and for introducing us to Janville. And I'm going to introduce Wyatt as he's getting ready to share his screen. Wyatt Arnold joined the Department of Water Resources in 2015 and currently works as a water resource engineer in DWR's climate change program. Wyatt has contributed to multiple DWR planning and technical assistance efforts, including the California Water Plan, Sustainable Groundwater Management, and the department's Climate Action Plan. Wyatt holds a BS in Civil Engineering from California State University, Sacramento, and is currently pursuing a master's in Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of California, Davis. So welcome, Wyatt, and looking forward to your presentation.
Right, thank you, Arit. Great, so I'm going to push us into maybe the next tier of what you might be able to accomplish for projecting water supply exposure and vulnerability using some statewide data sets that the department has released. I'll just say there are many ways to come at this problem. I'm going to present a data set that is sort of our best available information that synthesizes a lot of the information out there and might be more familiar to a lot of the planning frameworks that agencies are familiar with, and is being used as the recommended data set for sustainable groundwater management planning. So there's a good alignment there if you were to use this kind of information. So I'm going to start with, and I'm going to keep this in this view because I want you to be able to, or well, here, maybe I can just switch to keep it large as possible. So yeah, background development of scenarios, what these data sets contain. So you might be able to draw some connections on where you might input this information into your planning models. And then I'll just show, live what the data look like and where you can access them. So the big assumption here, though, is that you have a water system model that your organization agency uses to simulate water supply under daily, monthly, or annually varying conditions. So these data are for input to those models. We're not necessarily providing your water supply future. These climate data and other information simulated through the state projects are basically used as the bounding conditions to run your model with. Background development of scenarios. So this is sort of getting at those questions that maybe on some of your minds around, well, there's a lot of, there are actually a lot of models and they project very different things. So what are you actually providing us out of all of that information? Here's, just a kind of brief picture of the uncertainty that we face when we model climate change. These are the concentration pathways for different concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from around where we are now through the end of century. So we have RCP 2.6, which corresponds essentially 2.6, 4.5, 6, 8.5. They all correspond to an amount of radiative forcing that per square meter that the surface of the planet will have by that time under that concentration scenario. Now the climate responds to that concentration of greenhouse gases in a very complex way. We don't understand all the mechanisms and feedback mechanisms, and we don't have all those mechanisms in these global climate models. Some of them are poorly represented, and so we end up having a uncertain projection of the future, and that's the distribution on the right. We have many temperature, even for even for RCP 4.5, you will have temperature and precipitation scenarios which overlap with RCP 8.5 because there's a tremendous amount of variability in how our climate models respond or suggest the climate would respond to these increased greenhouse gas concentrations. So for California, we can take a sample of those triangles, and pluses are different models, RCP 8.5 and RCP 4.5, and it's the change in temperature on the y-axis and the change in precipitation, this is on annual average, that those models project over a historical period for that red outlined region in California. So essentially the Central Valley, everything draining into the Delta. And you can see that by 2050 here, we have 1 degree to 4 degrees of warming on an average annual basis, or negative 15% to positive, an additional 25% average annual precipitation. So that's an incredible amount of spread, and can result in completely different water supply conditions, flood conditions, water quality conditions, and it goes on and on. Now, all of that is actually happening on top of what obviously in our climate, there's already a tremendous amount of variability, even with the shock of climate change due to increased greenhouse gas emissions. So what we have here is a record based on tree rings of the hydrologic variability for the past 1100 years in California's climate. And you can see there are 3 periods there which have extended lengths of below normal or below average runoff in the Sacramento Ford River flow. And you just notice what Jenna showed you, they're one of those climate models for the extended drought scenario. It was a 20-year period with about 18 to 20% less average annual precip than the historical 1961 to 1990 average. Well, that's not unprecedented. In California's internal climate variability, we've already seen these kinds of extended 20 to 30-year periods of below average precip. They're rare, it's maybe a 5 to 8% chance of occurring in the next 50 years, but it's definitely there. So out of all of that information, there's a need to synthesize and use it for planning, making decisions. And so that's one of the reasons why this type of data set that I'll share with you has been prepared. basically we synthesize that large archive of information into a few scenarios, which indicate the central tendency, the ensemble mean, essentially, it's all the models, average them together, and or the bookends. So we have a very dry and warm model, and we also have a slightly less warm, wetter model at pretty far into the future. But you could still use those as bookends for any future period that kind of represent your range of maybe the kind of conditions you'd be potentially subjected to. So just kind of looking at that on that plot again, there's all the models in terms of change in temperature and precipitation. And we take all of that information and synthesize it down to these 4 scenarios. You can see that we have the 2030 and 20. So the historical is right there at 0, 0 on the plot. And then if you go up 2.5 degrees in change in temperature, and to the right about 3% additional average annual precip, that's the 2030 ensemble mean. And then if you go up to almost 6 degrees of Fahrenheit, this is in Fahrenheit, of warming, and a little over 5% additional precip, there's the 2070 ensemble mean. And then those 2 individual models that are to the far left in terms of a negative change in precipitation and quite high in terms of projected warming, that's the dry and extreme warming. And then to the far right, all the way up to over 20% additional precipitation and still quite warm, we would still be facing the impacts of declining snowpack and all other types of impacts associated with warming. However, in terms of maybe water supply, we wouldn't have as much shortage. On the other hand, we'd be facing some really difficult flood problems with that type of scenario. So DWR's climate scenario data sets, basically we're developing that central tendency of GCM model projected change. We're scaling that change down to local climate and water supply impacts. The figure here on the right is kind of meant to show you the umbrella of how these scenarios were formed. It started with a technical advisory group that the department chaired. 10 models were selected out of an archive of over 30 or 40 models, 2 RCPs. Those models were actually reviewed and summarized to create these 4 scenarios that I just presented for the Water Storage Investment Program. And then they were further repurposed for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. Now, even within this umbrella, the Delivery Capability Report, which many of you in the urban water management planning are probably very familiar with, that actually uses, most recently, those 10 models for both RCPs. It uses an ensemble mean of those CC tag scenarios to create a 2040 period-based future. So there's kind of the layout of the lineage of these data sets. Now, I'm going to go into what is contained in these data sets. Remember, all of this information, we're expecting that you would feed this into some sort of water supply model that you have. You may be able to do some other statistical analysis on it to bound certain conditions. You may not have to physically simulate all of this information, but you may be able to use it in other ways. So I'm going to call it the WSIP Sigma data, the 2 acronyms being Water Storage Investment Program and Sustainable Water Management Act. And we're suggesting that this is a fine data set to use also for urban water management planning. So what's contained? Number 1, climate data. So things like temperature, precipitation, and then other kinds of, temperature and precipitation at a daily or monthly scale. Then these are fed to a hydrologic model to simulate the energy balance in our watersheds. So we get things like runoff, snowpack, soil moisture, right, for the entire state. Then that kind of information, particularly runoff, feeds water operations. And we all know that we rely on a very extensive network of water supply operations. So we have a model for that, CalSim, and also we're very the network is very sensitive to what happens in the delta, and so there's modeling that happens in the delta to constrain and simulate what would happen under those changed climate conditions in terms of environmental objectives and water supply in the delta. And so all of that information produces projected deliveries and things like that. So water operations data for those 4 scenarios. We also provide extensive guidance on how all of this information was prepared, basically the model sequence, what specific models were used, and some tutorials and railings for how to understand what output variables come from which model. Basically, all the necessary data is there to incorporate in things like integrated groundwater surface water models, if you have that advanced of a planning team, or surface and reservoir simulation models, which maybe folks who aren't very groundwater dependent are more familiar with. So going into a little more detail, climate data. So what it is essentially is a daily, monthly time series data from 1915 to 2011. So what does that mean? Basically, we're taking the future signal change, so the change in monthly precipitation or temperature, and we are stamping that signal on top of a historical record. So we're basically shifting, the climate conditions of the sequence of wet and dry years that we've already experienced. And this actually can be really convenient in that we're all familiar with what happened from maybe 87 to 92 drought. And so now we can see what that same sequence of years would look like with 2 degrees of warming and a little bit more precip. And so we can see those conditions play out and compare those to things that we've already witnessed. And again, in detail, 16th degree resolution daily statewide precipitation temperatures available. That would be for the most advanced raw, granular data that you could use here. But then we also summarize that down to monthly change factors for precipitation and reference evapotranspiration. And you can subset that data to be input to your models. Hydrology data. So these are the inflows that are simulated based on that precipitation and temperature. We do that through VIC for the major rim inflows to the big project models like CalSim. But also we have that same VIC information summarized for all hydrologic units across the state. And so if you're looking to see what might happen in a watershed outside the Central Valley, we have that information. It does need a second order correction using local observational data for some gauge record over some time period can be used to construct a more full record based on the modeling data that we provide. So there's a process, I can show you the spreadsheet, that you can use to see what stream flow conditions might be in that watershed anywhere in the state. And then of course, the SJPP CVP is water supply data. So, in the delivery capability report, you'll have this summarized in tables very neatly that you can almost like read off of. If you're a contractor, directly dependent on that information. Some agencies obviously are depending on agencies who get water from the State Water Project. So I'm not really sure, where you are in that hierarchy, but this kind of information you still may want to draw on in a little more detail than that's contained in the delivery capability report. So there's that information. So access and download, basically there are 2 access points. The first is the Sigma data viewer. And this is possibly the easiest way to get at this data and do some spatial selection if you have a very specific output that you want. But then you can also go on the Natural Resources Agency's open data site and get the bulk downloads of this information, in addition to the guidance and some other technical details on how this was prepared to know, essentially how to better use the information. And so I'll show you that in a second. Additional sources include, of course, the Delivery Capability Report. And then, as I had a slide on at the very beginning, paleo information. That information is also hosted on open data, along with a very good guidebook, which talks through how those conditions are what is the expected recurrence of those historical conditions. How might you use that information in urban water management planning? So there's a guidebook for that, as well as all the raw data. And so those links are there. But now I'm going to show, let's see, 10:50. How am I on time?
I think you're okay, Wyatt.
Thank you. All right, so now I'm going to show the Sigma Data Viewer. All right, so here's the state, and here's the viewer, and over here on the left, you have these various categories. This is all centered around sustainable groundwater management, but these data that you could find useful are located in the water budget category here. And the first thing I'll show you is the gridded precipitation in ET. And you can see that that's covering the entire state in 16th degree. And so you could do a user-defined selection of that information by extent, polygon, or even uploading your own shapefile. You select tiles, you download that information from that large archive. And again, that would be monthly information that you would be inputting to your models. You can also download that information by county. And so I've actually done that for Monterey right here. And I will show you that. So that's the Monterey information in terms of monthly evapotranspiration and precipitation change factors. So when I say change factor, that means you have a historical observed climate from 1915 to 2011. And what you're expected to do is use these change factors to perturb, to change that information to reflect the future climate signal. And the reason it's precip and ET is because mainly this is meant to force an integrated groundwater surface water model that simulates land surface processes. You may be interested in the monthly precip if you're not necessarily putting it into that type of model. Now, if we go to streamflow change factors, this is the kind of information that you may use if you're relying on local streams and you want to know what the signal of change might be in those local streams according to those climate conditions. And so I've downloaded this hydrologic unit. You can see that all these purple outlines represent all the different summarized hydrologic units in terms of stream flow that we have based on this information. I've downloaded this one in the Salinas Valley. And so that's what this looks like. We have annual change factors and monthly change factors. And so the annual change factors are basically summarized for each future: 2030, 2070, dry extreme warming, wet moderate warming. And I've just plotted the time series here for you to visually see what this information is. right? There's 1, that's no change from that historical value. And then you have like something like a very wet future here, where you have months that go up to 4 times as much stream flow in that hydrologic unit as on top above historical. So that could mean good things for water supply or potentially bad things, because too much stream flow could cause flooding, compromise your treatment plants, compromise other types of infrastructure that your water supply is integrated with. So
Excuse me, Wyatt.
yes.
I don't think that we can see the plots that you are speaking of. We're still looking at the Sigma data viewer.
Oh,
Do
I
you
see.
want to switch? You have to, I think, reshare that.
Okay.
And we probably have a couple more minutes for you to go over these, and then there are several questions that we're going to want to have time for. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, so sorry about that. Yeah, and I'll move quickly through these last 2 spreadsheets. So there are the annual stream flow change factors that I was describing. There's that very wet model. You'll see up to 4 times of a change. On average, maybe twice the stream flow on an annual basis. But that's a very extreme case, right? We also have the 2030, which is maybe slightly more than average. We have a dry extreme warming, which does show that in certain months you would have stream flow that's almost twice as high, but you'd also have months that are actually much drier, and so you have a more variable signal in your stream flow that can actually have very dry conditions. But that information needs to be corrected, and the way you get, we've provided these full dataset download links, as well as if you go to the open data site, you'll see this Sigma second order change factor correction tool, and I'll show you that now. And there's some guidance on how to use it, but basically you need to input your own observed unimpaired stream flow for that hydrologic area for any period of time. And so that's the only local information that you need to put here on a monthly basis. And the monthly change factors are basically copied and pasted out of that information you downloaded for that hydrologic unit. And then basically the output does the bias correction based on the local observational data, so that you can have bias corrected future stream flow that you could base some runoff projections on that you might need for your water supply planning. And finally, here in the CVP and SWP contractor delivery tables, that's the kind of information that has already been simulated through CalSim and provides this range of annual delivery conditions that the projects are expected to meet under those future conditions. And so I'll show that here. So you'll have these output time series for different contractors for every month in 1,000 acre feet for different contract entitlements. I pulled out information for Santa Clara Valley and summarized it by the annual level, aggregated to the annual level, plotted it as a time series, and maybe that's not so helpful, but you can also then do the exceedance plot to see, okay, well, under the base condition, the historical condition, I mean, obviously there's quite a range of variability in what kind of deliveries we can expect from the State Water Project. And then under these different projected futures, what is the change in the volume for a given exceedance level that we might be relying on in our water supply portfolio, or the average and so forth. And so this kind of information can also help you navigate what kind of supply might be available to the wholesalers, or if you're a contractor directly on that, and you're probably already aware of that. But that information is summarized for those 4 scenarios. So I'll stop there, and please don't hesitate to contact me later if you want more information.
Great, thanks, Wyatt. So we have several questions. Some of them has to do with how to take this information and use it with the urban water management plan. So maybe some of these questions are for both Wyatt and Julie to tag team in terms of responding to. And this was obviously a lot of information condensed into a short presentation, so there's a lot more to explore there. One question with regard to that is wanting to know if DWR has some kind of a document or language, standard language that sufficiently and succinctly describes the range of GCMs, input assumptions, and range of outputs for a layperson audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we have a 2-pager, or even better, a 1-pager that would lay that out. That's a great ask. However, I can think of 2 key documents that I think would summarize, and you would find the kind of layperson targeted language that describes that type of information. The first is actually I mentioned the Climate Change Technical Advisory Group, were the group that selected those 10 models based on different metrics and considerations for California's climate and water planning. They produced a document called the Perspectives and Guidance for Climate Change. Might be another word in that title, but basically they break down a lot in a digestible form. You know, it's not an academic paper. It's meant for planners and managers to understand climate change information and the way that we went about synthesizing that information and selecting models. And it talks a lot about what kind of changes are expected and how to parse that information in the best way possible. The second document is the Sustainable Groundwater Management's own guidance document for how to use the data sets I presented. And it walks through in, and some of that information may not be in any way useful to you because it's focused on sustainable groundwater management planning and the kind of regulatory guidance they needed to provide in that. But in terms of the data set, how it was prepared and how it might be used, that guidance document covers that in detail.
Great, thanks, Wyatt. Is that something that we can provide a link in the chat? Okay.
Yeah, I will post that, right?
All right, great, thank you. Okay, so we have several questions, so maybe we can be succinct in responding. If a retail agency imports all of its water from a wholesaler who is analyzing climate models and analyzing impacts on their water supply availability, what practical local climate change elements and impacts should retail agency include in using in their 2020 plan?
You want to answer it? What? I mean,
no, go ahead, Julie.
Oh yeah, I would suggest that then if you have access to their different scenarios of how climate change affects the supply, that for your local assessment in your urban water management plan, that you could look maybe more at the demand and how projections might affect your demands into the future, which Ben is going to talk a little bit about.
Okay. Thanks. And this is another question probably for you, Julie. Is narrative language sufficient to meet climate change requirements for considerations, or are specific adjustment made from in calculations required to appear within the plan to meet these requirements?
Well, we go by what the water code specifies, and so the narrative language would be sufficient. Yeah, we would recommend that you could, and I think I see another related question lower down, but you might want to take some of the tables, and if you don't want to include the numbers, around climate change scenarios in those submission tables or submittal tables, you could also do, paste them as you do in your plan. And you could do, say, here's what this table looks like under this climate change scenario. This is what it looks like under this climate change scenario. And then address it in the narrative of how your water supplier is thinking about mitigating these impacts. That's what we would recommend.
And this is more of an analysis question of, can you discuss how to reconcile incorporating ranges of climate change possibilities into required drought risk and water supply assessments? How can ranges of future conditions be presented in the required tabular format?
Okay, so this is the question I was thinking of. So you could put, so in your plan itself, you may, you could take, you have your Excel tables, and maybe it's, well, I don't know, I can't remember what the table numbers are, but say it's 6-9 or something. You could do multiple iterations of that and say, here it is without incorporating climate change projections. And maybe that's what you choose to submit into the electronic data portal, the WUI data portal that we have. But you also include those tables in your plan itself, whether you do screenshots or, you copy and paste them into your plan, and then you just talk about them, or, in the narrative. So you could have you could have 2 different versions of 6-9 table. So that says, this is under assumptions without climate change. This is with these assumptions of climate change. These are, this is another scenario of climate change, so that you have everything in one place that, for your own analysis of, okay, these are the kinds of questions we're thinking of that we need to deal with, that we need to ask ourselves, for planning into the future and investing in possible other sources or other approaches that could mitigate these impacts.
Thank you. So essentially the narrative is there to explain how you've filled in the tables. And that's something that you've mentioned throughout the workshops, that you can use the narrative to explain the process that you're going through and the decisions.
Yes.
Looks like the models are more for wholesale use, and asking about tools, elements that are available for retail agencies receiving all their water from wholesalers. What is the minimum information required to submit in the 2020 plan for climate change from retail agencies?
So again, we point back to the water code of what is required, and it's not specified in the water code of how it must be submitted and analyzed, how climate change needs, what that means to incorporate it or to consider it. So that, it's up to your discretion, really. And if Sabrina's on the participating right now, she might want to chime in or clarify if needed, but.
Well,
Here she is.
keep in mind that this is your plan for your planning purposes, for understanding how reliable your water will be in the future. Are you going to have enough supplies? Do you need to do something before it comes up to that point that you're out of water? And so it's really important to look at this climate change assessment, because it's going to affect your water service reliability in the future. And how you best look at that will depend on your situation, because it depends on what supplies you've got, what supplies you might be able to get, where you are, how complex your system is or not, or things like that. So there's flexibility allowed for you to do a climate change analysis that best fits the situation for your planning purposes, so that when it comes to 2030, 2040, you're okay. Or what's coming up, so you've planned for it, instead of just being caught unawares. So that's, the flexibility is there for you to do what works best for your situation.
Thanks, Sabrina. Okay, so I think that answers all the questions that have been posted. Thanks, Wyatt, for your presentation, and we'll take 5 minutes, just a quick break, and we'll come back to our third presentation at 11:21. Thanks, everyone. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hoping everybody's back. Checking in to make sure that Benjamin is with us since he's our third presenter.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, welcome. All right, so let me just introduce you as you're getting ready with your presentation. Benjamin Hatchett studies the hydrometeorology and hydroclimatology of mountain and dryland regions at timescales ranging from minutes to millennia in the past, present, and future as a regional climatologist at the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno, Nevada. The majority of his work has focused on California and the Western US, but has recently expanded to South America. Benjamin has conducted climate change analysis to support water planning in California, including for Ventura River watershed, which he will be speaking about as part of his presentation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for inviting me to come speak about some of our work. And what I'm hoping to do is really to expand on what Jennifer and Wyatt have talked about and kind of show you some examples of how you can take available climate change projection information and really try to squeeze it and leverage it in ways that may additionally inform your water management planning. And so I just want to talk a little bit about data availability and some considerations that hopefully will sort of maybe expand your mind in terms of better ways to address your problems and kind of think about, is the data available to ask and answer questions of interest? Are there certain processes that you would like more information about? Because from the research side, it's really valuable for us to know what we can make available to you, because oftentimes there's a ton more information produced by weather and climate models that are run into the future that may not necessarily be readily available. But if there are things that would help you, it's very good to know that so that we can make those things available. So that first consideration is really, what processes or problems are you aiming to address in your management planning? And like Julie had mentioned, there's the demand versus the supply side and the connection of those two things into reliability. But I also want to bring in the idea of dealing with hazards, which is sort of peripherally related to that in terms of things like urban runoff and flooding versus riverine type flooding, other hazards that may impact your communities or your water resources infrastructure or other types of, say, transportation infrastructure, such as debris flows and landslides. And how can some of the infrastructure that you're planning for help to not only mitigate these hazards, but perhaps leverage them into becoming a little bit more beneficial, such as in the case of urban runoff storage and using that for groundwater recharge or other beneficial uses. In terms of the spatial scale of projections, typically data is made available in either a point sense, so just a single location, or spatially distributed, and that's what the CalAdapt website will also provide, are these gridded outputs of climate projections. And a big question to ask yourself is, what scale do you need to achieve your objectives? At spatial grids of, do you need on the order of meters? Do you need hundreds of meters, 4 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 50 kilometers? What scale do you need? Because if the data is available, it can always interpolate to those levels, but at some point, whether or not the interpolation is actually useful is an important question to ask. And there are ways to produce higher resolution outputs that are still physically meaningful in terms of the model correctly resolving terrain or other land surface factors. And so that's an important consideration to have. Then we have the temporal scales, which really gets into the processes and the problems. I know there was a question about return intervals of precipitation. So a big piece for flood hazard management and other natural hazards is the high intensity, short duration question of how will sub-daily, sub-hourly, say 10-minute rainfall rates change, and how does that tie into your reliability and drought planning. So there's many different scales from annual, decadal, all the way down into the hourly and sub-hourly time scales, and knowing which ones of those are important is really valuable for us. Another question, and something we've experienced, is do you need a range of outcomes or a suite of realizations to kind of create this envelope of possibilities that Wyatt was showing a nice example of? Is it helpful to know what 30 different projections are suggesting so you can kind of bound what you expect as the best case and the worst case scenario, and where, say, 75% of the models agree on some amount of change? And then the last question to ask yourself, which is kind of hard, perhaps because it's hard to see the if there are known unknowns, but you don't know what they are, that can be challenging. But are there unforeseen issues that we call blind spots that may not be an issue historically or even now, but could later become an issue? And so that's kind of a way to sit back and think deeply and philosophically about what's going on in your area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience with Ventura County and helping them put together their UWMP plan. And this was kind of a multi-year process that we started in 2017. It was very iterative, which I found extremely helpful, and included many different meetings with stakeholders from various agencies, basically across the board, from the GSAs to the water providers, agriculture, flood control, fisheries, all kinds of people. And it was extremely helpful to identify issues with the stakeholders, try to address them with relevant metrics that we developed, revisit with them what we came up with, and continue to improve them to make these useful. And we largely used the CalAdapt products to do so, but there's a lot you can really do with those, and I'm going to show a couple examples of this. And the report was released in 2019. There's a link to the bottom, and it was really intended to support both UWMP and the urban water management planning processes. So maybe there could be some hopefully helpful ideas in there, and I'm happy to work with anyone who's interested on incorporating this information. So one example approach, and this is kind of a spatially distributed approach. So we're working in Ventura County, so on the south coast of California. And so there's the several of the rivers, the Ventura River on the left-hand side, the Santa Clara River kind of in the center, Los Angeles County on the right. Starting with the daily calculations, we went through a number of thresholds of interest. And here we're using the CalAdapt extreme heat threshold as an example, which is the number of days that exceed the 98th percentile minimum or maximum temperature. And so we calculate this at each grid point. And what we show here is the minimum amount of change that 75% of the 32 models have. So this kind of gives you an idea that 3/4 of the model outputs are suggesting at least this much change in terms of the number of days exceeding this 98th percentile minimum temperature between the two time periods of interest, so the historical and the future. The other thing you can do with this that we found to be helpful is for given points, and so on the right-hand side, there's several different locations, and show the distribution of what all the models are suggesting. So you can have the 75th percentile, which is basically the top of that box plot. But you can see either the median, which is the center line in the box, there's a pretty large amount of spread between the models. So this kind of gives you an idea of what's the worst case, what's the best case scenario, and where are most of the models falling in this, just to give you an idea of what is the range of outcomes. Are we, would we be resilient to the best case or the worst case, or how far off might we be? Another example is using the calculation of reference evapotranspiration, or ETO. And here we are looking at these ETO calculations in terms of different seasons. So we can go through and look at the winter, spring, summer, and fall seasons and get a spatial idea of how those changes are taking place, because that may factor into water supply reliability in terms of the supply side of, if ETO is increasing greatly in your headwater regions, that's probably going to translate to less runoff. If ETO is increasing in your areas where the demand is the bigger question, such as with regards to urban water use or agricultural use, that's another piece of the story to consider. So ETO is a very nice tool because it, or metric, I should say, because it allows you to look at both kind of the supply and demand side, because it's essentially the demand of the atmosphere. And then on the bottom, you can look at, again, those distributions for given points to kind of get an idea of how much change is going to take place as a function of season and how much spread in the models there is. And so the main take home here is you can really see how there's a net increase across all seasons, but that increase is the most marked in spring and summer, and the smallest in the winter. The precipitation problem gets quite interesting in terms of climatic change. What we see is very small changes on average. If you take the median of all the models, there's not a big change. That's the left-hand image there. And so we see small changes in terms of a handful of models are projecting a decrease in precipitation and a little bit more spread on the increase in precipitation change at an annual time scale. So I could see this being a little bit difficult when you're showing that, wow, there's some dry, some wet. What does that really mean? Not super good consensus. However, if we start digging a little bit deeper and calculating changes in, say, the contribution of the wettest days, so the top 5% of the wettest days, how are those changing with regards to their contribution to total precipitation? Now we see better agreement in that many of the models are leaning towards a likely increase in the contribution of the wettest days. So this is pointing towards increased precipitation extremes. So even though things are getting drier, on the background side because of warming and increased demand, and we see an increase in the number of dry days, so fewer days with precipitation, the days that do have precipitation are going to more likely be characterized by intense or extreme precipitation. And sometimes the available products aren't quite enough. The daily time scale of all of these statistically downscaled projections is insufficient to answer needs. And there are other options to look at with regards to addressing some of these other important questions, notably the short duration, high intensity precipitation. And so one thing we did in the Ventura report was we utilized a pseudo global warming experiment, which basically takes a weather model run over a historical period, warms it up, and reruns it. And we can look at the differences in terms of, here we're showing the number of events where a threshold of 25 millimeters per hour was exceeded. And on the left-hand side, that's our base or control experiment. The perturbed experiment in the center is the same period of time, just warmed up several degrees based on the RCP. I think this was the 8.5 projection. And then on the right-hand side, that shows you the change in the event count. And so you can see some pretty notable increases particularly in the mountains with regards to an increased frequency of these high intensity, short duration precipitation events. These types of experiments can also be helpful because I know in water resource management, there's a lot of interest and constant kind of tying back to historic events of interest, like let's say the flood of record or some crazy event that was experienced that we would prefer to either not have again, or if it does have again, be prepared for it. And these kinds of modeling experiments are helpful for that because we can take an event. Here we're showing the January 7 to 11, 2005 storm event. On the left-hand side, that's what happened. In the middle, that's what it would look like if you warmed the climate up. And then on the right-hand side, that shows you how the change in total precipitation was intensified on the order of about half to an inch or so of total precipitation. And one caveat with these pseudo global warming experiments are that they don't resolve all of the larger scale changes that may ultimately be taking place in a warmer climate. So they're not a perfect representation of what potentially going to take place, but they are a piece of information that can at least point you in the right direction. And so that's why it's important to leverage and utilize all the available pieces of information to try to paint a picture of how things may change, because none of these models are actually going to be what will take place, but they can at least point you in the direction of likely changes. Another brief experience I'll relate was taking the Ventura work and working with the State Water Board, who's developing an integrated hydrologic model for the Ventura River. They had the limitation of only being able to include one climate change scenario as input. So they had a suite of scenarios they were using in their model. They only had time to run one through. And so we wanted to figure out what's the best climate change type scenario to run. And so in doing so, we wanted to leverage the best scientific consensus to really truncate the suite of possible outcomes, which in my opinion points towards a hotter, drier California overall, punctuated by occasionally wet years and a more variable, interannually varying climate. So we're gonna generally see warmer, drier with occasional wet years and stronger occasional storms. And in doing so, we could take all of the different climate realizations from all of these models and plot them up in terms of changes in annual temperature along the x-axis, changes in median annual precipitation in the y-axis, look at the change in precipitation coefficient of variation, so that variability, that's how the dots are colored, and then ultimately settle on a model where we kind of agree of perhaps the scenario of interest. And in this case, we opted for a worst case kind of scenario. We ended up picking a hot, dry outcome because we think that was sort of one of the worst case situations for fisheries management in this case. One thing to keep in mind when you do this is these dots are based on aggregating spatially distributed information to a point. So in the upper right corner, you can see just an example of the I'm not sure if I'm showing, I think I'm showing precipitation on there, blue being the lowest and white being higher for the basin. That all gets condensed into one value. So it's important to keep in mind how spatial patterns may be lost when you aggregate to a single point. And this can all kind of be used to think about stress testing and provide some qualitative bounds on your existing resiliency. How would things look if we shifted to be a couple degrees warmer and lost a quarter of our annual precipitation, for example? You can also use some realizations of these climate models for more advanced scenario development and starting to look at not just singular events, but multiple cascading or compound events, which is really, I think, an important concept to start integrating into our water resource management, not just looking at a 5-year drought period, for example, but how would things do if we had that 5-year drought period followed by an extreme wet year, followed by another drought year, followed by wildfire and debris flows that then damage our infrastructure. So you can start using some of these climate model projections if they're made available. And I recognize that this is probably on the far end of the advanced side of the spectrum to be able to really mine these projections to figure out what's the likelihood of these scenarios. But I think it's an important concept for you to think about what would be some of your worst case multi-year scenarios of a compound and cascading extreme event situation. The Montecito debris flow is a perfect example of that, where it was really a challenge of land use, drought, wet, drought, fire, flood. What might some of those scenarios look like? And then we on the climate science side can help you look for those and kind of give you an idea of what's the likelihood of that taking place? Do we start to see these sequences of events become not just a 1 in 10, a 1 in 20, 1 in 50 year kind of extreme event? When do they become episodic and happen every few years or just kind of consistently? The challenge, of course, with these is they really do span a huge variety of time and space scales. So we're thinking about drought and thinking about interannual or multi-year or even decadal scales of time, but then the finer time scales, just a few big storm events can really green up fuels substantially, and then you can go back into the slower drought process. Fire, of course, is sort of an instantaneous ignition and a days to weeks timescale, and then the rain and debris flow problem is really back to the sub-hourly timescale. Just in 15 minutes, a lot can change. I think this is a valuable thing to think about as well in terms of it becoming really a transboundary problem, in that this can affect a specific city or agency or agencies within that city, but in a lot of cases it influences multiple cities or agencies spanning both the or various levels of government. And I think this is a good opportunity to further develop collaboration between the city and the region and the various agencies to kind of think about how can we deal with these problems, both from a planning, mitigation, adaptation, and emergency response perspective. So a few other thoughts that I'll finish up with here are really to think about from all of the presentations that you've seen. What do you need or want from climate projections that you're not getting? Be creative. If it's we as climate scientists can't come up with everything, and it's very helpful to be told what to look for, and we can try to see if we can get that for you. Always be considering of or give consideration to thresholds of interest for whatever process or problem of interest. Are you able to calculate metrics to address these kinds of thresholds? That's something that we can try to improve the availability of as well. In the use of historic extremes, such as floods of records, I think it's important to think and focus on more recent extremes, just because some of you that have been in the game for a long time may totally remember the great flood of '83, for example, but people my age were either watching cartoons or not around yet, and maybe coming into the business now and aren't as familiar with that, but we certainly can remember some of the more recent events. So I think to really engage the community in this process, a focus on recent extremes and say, hey, remember when did your basement flood in 2005? Well, that wasn't very fun, was it? What can we do to stop that? In terms of planning horizons, thinking across a spectrum of years, I'm not sure what all of you operate on or what the plans require, but thinking in terms of sort of tiered planning horizons is helpful, because one expectation that we're starting to see is that things are happening sooner than we expect. And so if we're operating on a 10-year planning horizon, but we get something that's projected to happen in 50 years and it happens now, we don't want to be maladapted for when that does take place. That's kind of the lower point on there that I'll come to in just a second again. Another suggestion is to try and really weave the thread of the climate change narrative into all the aspects of your planning process and your document. The more you can tie it back to these changes, I think that will really help tie this critical piece of the story of our changing environment into your planning efforts. And then again, this concept of when are events going from extreme to episodic? What are the thresholds of concern that highlight that transition? What are the vulnerabilities that exist in that transition? What's the time to emergence of this shift? Have we already seen it? That's kind of one concern that we've been talking a bit about, is that, well, we didn't really expect the mid-century climate to already be here in the 2010s and 2020s. We hoped we had a few more decades, but now it seems like we're in it. So that brings me back to this final point of, in terms of maybe stress testing your vulnerabilities, what if you assume that the worst case model outcome projected for the end of the century is actually worse and happens in 2045 or 2025? Things to think about. So with that, thank you guys very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Great, thanks, Benjamin. Really appreciate especially your summary of the things to think about as you're working through all of the information and data that would be important. I'm looking to see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions specific to your presentation. Let's see if there are any hand raises. I don't see any. Maybe we can give people some time to see if they want to ask any questions. I don't see any questions. Oh, except the comment that this, thanking you for your presentation. It was quite informative.
You're very welcome.
Great. And so what we wanted to do, and thanks, Benjamin, for your presentation. I wanted to see if, in addition to questions about your presentation specifically, if participants have any thoughts or suggestions about tools or information that they're thinking about using, that they want to share with everyone as kind of a way to use this time as a bit of an exchange among participants. So curious to see if anybody wants to share what they're thinking of using and how they're going to go about doing this. Let's see. A question that we have here, could you address the issue of reconciling DWR outdoor conservation targets with demand forecasts that account for climate change impacts? Maybe that's a question for Julie.
In terms of, maybe they could clarify what they mean by reconciling.
Yeah, I'm not sure beyond this. If this question comes from Amparo Flores, and so if you want to speak in person, happy to address the question. Okay, here we go. All right, go ahead, Amparo.
Yeah, it's really just a general question. I'm just mulling over how to use the information that we learned today. We've just completed a regional demand study, and which hasn't incorporated any of these climate change impacts, but I'm thinking about if we do want to incorporate that, how do we then apply, and maybe perhaps I just need a little bit more information too on how DWR is developing the outdoor conservation targets. So how those two would mesh together. Do the DWR outdoor conservation targets account for climate change impacts, or do we apply that on our end and then layer on top of that the figuring out how to meet the conservation targets? Does that clarify anything? Sorry, I'm still also just kind of working through how these different things relate to each other.
Yeah, so my understanding that, and I don't know if Sabrina is still on the line, but she knows a lot more about the outdoor water conservation targets than I do.
Hi, Amparo. The water conservation targets, they're not really targets. They'll be standards, and they'll be rolled into the objectives and all that other fun stuff, which is coming down the road. And it hasn't been developed, nor has the process been quite identified, but it is going to be based, as required by code, on the principles of MWELO, which include things like ETO. And as such, as climate changes, ETO will change. So you're going to run into that kind of incorporation of climate change into the annual calculations, because it's calculated every year. So, that will help for that. However, you do bring up a good point that it needs to be considered in the long-term standard that is developed when it's developed, which it hasn't been yet. So we're still working on that. For what you were talking about with all your demand forecasting that you've come up with, where you haven't done the climate change, incorporation, one of the things you can do is look at the various resources, like I forgot the name of that tool that was first shown, and see what kind of things are likely. ET is going to go up, this is going to happen, etc. And come up with a maybe a factor on top of the demand scenarios. So the demand scenarios that, we've run without climate change say this, we anticipate with climate change, it might be this. Does that make sense?
And that tool that Sabrina mentioned is CalAdapt.
CalAdapt. Or we might end up with this situation. This is how our demand forecast is done without climate change. With climate change, we might end up in these scenarios.
Yes, thank you. But thanks for, I guess as DWR is developing those outdoor conservation guidelines, it would be good to be very clear about incorporation of, anticipated climate change impacts on that end.
All right, great, thank you. So I don't see any additional specific comments related to the presentation. I want to thank all our 3 presenters today, and I think I'll turn it over to you, Julie, for next steps and other upcoming workshops. It might be helpful to also answer questions. There have been questions about when things will be available. So if you can speak to that as well.
Sure, and I see that we have one other open question here on the Q&A that says, in past webinars, some questions are answered only in this Q&A panel and not read or answered out loud. And after I saw this, I minimized typing any answers, but so for answers, she says, for answers that include links, it would be helpful if they could also be made available when watching the videos on YouTube. And is there anything where that text is made available? So we'll discuss it with the facilitators and with the public affairs to see if there's some way that we can post that to make it available, because I understand that would be useful. So thank you for that question. And then another person notes, retailers would appreciate practical tools to analyze their local systems for vulnerabilities to climate change. So we would first point you to CalAdapt, which is what Jennifer walked through, and I think Ben also talked about it, because those are the statewide projections for climate change that the state has funded and developed and posted there for and made into a pretty usable website to explore the data that's available, and it's pretty user friendly that and is widely used. Okay, so
Julie, just before you move on, there's also a comment from Lisa that you may want to read, just for tracking that for the record.
Okay, so Lisa Mattis says, this was very informative. I agree with Sabrina Cook's answer. We are using CalAdapt's tools and modeling increased ETO into our demand forecasting scenarios, including end-use conservation modeling. We currently are doing this for the Urban Water Management Plan round of planning. Also, the summer demand peak load on water supplies and treatment capacity has major implications on future capital investments. So for those that do the water master plans for utilities. Okay. One side curious question. Are you coordinating with the CAL FIRE USFS on their fuel load modeling? So much runoff is driven by soil moisture in the forests, a major impact on Sierra Nevada runoff. The water use efficiency branch hasn't been coordinating with CAL FIRE on their fuel load modeling, and I don't know if that's finalized yet or if that's still in development, but that's an interesting thing to flag. And I'm not sure if it's incorporated into the work that Wyatt presented, but I would expect that it would be in the next iteration of the 5th climate assessment for California, because that's a major emphasis right now. Fire, of course. I'll just go ahead and mention these other questions.
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So Kelsey mentions, I haven't heard about sea level rise. We have a coastal aquifer. Does CalAdapt have links for ranges of sea level rise as well? If not, can you recommend? So yes, there is sea level rise data on and projections on CalAdapt. There's also USGS has, and Kevin Beffis, who's out of, I think, University of Arkansas now, they came out with projections of sea level rise intruding into coastal aquifers. And that just came out in 2020. So we can point you, I'm gonna look up that link and point it to you, because that data is all available online on an open platform. And so you can download it, the GIS files or the other spatial files by county, and you can stitch them together if you want a big region, or you can just look at to explore your own region of where they're projecting that saltwater intrusion will increase under sea level rise conditions. And I'll look that up in just a minute. So Don Taffler asks what tool would be recommended for data for sea level rise in combination with coastal floods, the king tides. And the USGS is, Ben or Wyatt, do you guys remember what that the tool is that
Cosmos? Is it Cosmos?
I think they have one that
It simulates storms with sea level rise.
Yes, and so is that statewide now? Because it used to be Southern California, but Don, we can send that out. I'll craft a thank you for participating today with some additional links that address these questions about tools, and then need to figure out how to get them posted as part of the YouTube, or at least archive somehow for the training, so other people can get that information. But thank you for flagging that, and we'll get to those. Unless Ben or Wyatt want to say, or Jenna want to say anything else about sea level rise. No, okay. Okay. Well, great. So great. Thank you, Michelle, for your comment. So for upcoming training opportunities, I guess I also want to thank our presenters. I am so grateful for their expertise and sharing their knowledge with us. I think we have, this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of where you can go with climate change, but I think we got a really good start, and hope that your suppliers or your agency pursues more kind of analysis and assessment about how climate change could play a role in your water reliability and your planning into the future. For upcoming trainings for urban water management plan preparation, they are all available on the YouTube site. So there is a link there. There's another one, I think, that's been in the chat that goes specifically to the urban water management plan playlist on YouTube. We have three more trainings that are planned. The January 27th is going to be focused on water shortage contingency plan development. February 10th is the plan preparation and submittal procedures. And then by March or probably April, we'll have the WUI data portal. That's an electronic submission portal. And that's where you're going to submit all of your information, including we'll have forms that you'll paste in your information from the tables to submit it. And so how to walk through that, we'll do that once that's ready. So the date is coming soon. I also wanted to flag that January 26th, there's a NOAA and Water Research Foundation is hosting a workshop on a webinar, Filling the Gaps, climate and weather information for small and medium-sized water utilities. So that one could be very applicable to this. They've done great work related to this, to helping suppliers plan for climate change. And so thank you all. If you need the materials and you aren't already part of the stakeholder SharePoint, please contact James Campagna at the email below, wue@water.ca.gov. And thank you all for participating today. We appreciate it.
And Julie, can you just speak to when the guidebook will be, the final guidebook will be available? There were several questions about that
Yes,
throughout the workshop.
We're working on it. I mean, in terms of just finalizing the last edits and getting it to the copy editors for final checks. And so we're hoping in the next few weeks. We know you need it and want it, so we're definitely prioritizing that. So, and as we've said in some of the other webinars, that it actually happened that these training webinars and your questions were really helpful for making some additions or corrections or clarifications in the guidebook. So that's been really helpful. And but yes, coming soon, and we will certainly send a notification out to you through the Urban listserv. So if you're not on that, please send a request to James again at wue@water.ca.gov, and that would be to request to be put on the Urban listserv. Thanks, Arit.
All right. Yeah, I just put the poll to just get a sense from people if they felt that this was helpful. And thanks to all our presenters.